Hey guys, tonight we're taking a truly uncomfortable journey back to the very origins of democracy, to the bustling, sun-drenched city-states of ancient Greece, particularly Athens, famed as the birthplace of this revolutionary form of government. But forget the romanticized images of toga-clad philosophers debating in the agora and the enlightened ideals of citizen participation. You're about to discover how Greek democracy was a terrible system for most people, a grim reality where the vast majority of the population was systematically excluded from the democratic process. Born into a life without political voice or fundamental rights, this wasn't a universal ideal, it was a deeply flawed, exclusive club that thrived on the subjugation of others. Frankly, you probably wouldn't qualify to even step foot in the assembly, let alone survive the daily realities of non-citizen life. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself suddenly standing in Athens. Around the 5th century BCE, the height of its democratic power, the Parthenon gleams on the Acropolis. The agora hums with activity, and the air is thick with the scent of olive oil, spices, and the clamor of a thriving city. You hear passionate speeches, lively debates, and the constant murmur of a society deeply engaged in civic life. But as you look around, you realize a chilling truth about this democracy. You are not a citizen. This is the illusion of freedom, where being born a non-citizen immediately condemns you to a life without political voice, making Greek democracy a terrible system for you, the most fundamental and perhaps most shocking aspect of Athenian democracy was its incredibly narrow definition of citizen. When we speak of the people demos in Greek democracy, it did not mean everyone in Athens, only free, adult, male, Athenian-born individuals who had completed their military training, the ephebeia, were considered full citizens. Imagine that women, slaves, and foreign residents, medics, all permanent residents of Athens were entirely excluded. This meant that the celebrated democracy of Athens, at its peak, only included roughly 10-15% of the total population as active participants. The vast majority were systematically disenfranchised from birth. It truly sucked to be voiceless in a democracy. For you, if you were born female, enslaved, or foreign, your entire life would unfold under the shadow of this fundamental exclusion. You would contribute to the economy. You would live under Athenian laws, but you would have absolutely no say in their creation, their amendment, or their enforcement. Your very existence was outside the political sphere, reduced to a functional role in a system that valued your labor or your reproductive capacity, but not your political will or your individual voice. Let's break down these excluded groups. Women, whether citizen wives, foreign women, or slaves. Women in Athens had no political rights whatsoever. They could not vote, hold office, attend the assembly ecclesia, or participate in public life. Their role was primarily confined to the household oikos, managing the domestic sphere, raising children, and maintaining the family's property. While wealthy citizen women might exert some indirect influence through their male relatives, their direct voice was non-existent. Imagine living in a society that celebrated intellectual debate and civic participation, but explicitly denied you any part in it, reducing your entire existence to domesticity. It truly sucked to be an invisible half of the population. Slaves. This was the largest excluded group, forming a substantial portion. Estimates vary widely, but often 25-40% or more of the Athenian population. Slaves had no rights, no property, and no political voice. Their lives were dedicated to serving their masters in fields, mines, workshops, or households. Their labor was the very bedrock upon which Athenian democracy and its leisure for male citizens was built. The freedom of Athenian citizens was, ironically, directly dependent on the brutal subjugation of a vast enslaved population. Imagine seeing yourself as property, your life utterly controlled by another, in a city that preached freedom, metics, foreign residents. These were free individuals who lived in Athens but were not Athenian-born. They could be wealthy merchants, skilled craftsmen, or intellectuals drawn to Athens' vibrant culture. They paid taxes, often served in the military, especially in the navy, and contributed significantly to the Athenian economy and cultural life. However, they had no political rights. They could not vote, hold office, or own land, though they could own businesses and other property. They were perpetual outsiders, residents without a voice, always subject to the whims of the citizen body. Imagine contributing your wealth and skill to a city that welcomed your money but silenced your voice. This profound exclusion, this systemic disenfranchisement of the vast majority was not viewed as a contradiction by the Athenians themselves. They believed that only those with a direct, inherited stake in the polis city-state, those who could serve in the military, contribute financially, and participate in civic duties from birth were truly qualified to govern for them. Democracy was about the rule of citizens, not a universal franchise. The very public spaces of Athenian democracy, like the Nix the Hill where the assembly met, or the agora, the central marketplace and civic center, were explicitly reserved for citizen men. If you were a woman, a slave, or a metic, you could observe from a distance or perform your duties nearby, but you could not enter these sacred spaces of civic discourse and participation as an equal. You were always an observer, never a participant. One common misconception is that ancient Greek democracy was a direct ancestor of modern universal suffrage. In reality, while Athens pioneered direct citizen participation, its model was inherently exclusive, based on restrictive criteria that would be considered profoundly undemocratic by modern standards. The expansion of voting rights to include women, non-landowners, and other marginalized groups is a much later development in the history of democracy. Fundamentally different from the Athenian model, historians still meticulously study the precise criteria for Athenian citizenship and the demographic composition of Athenian society to understand the true scale of this political exclusion, often finding that the percentage of the population actively participating in democracy was surprisingly small. Furthermore, the language used to describe these non-citizens often reflected their excluded status. Slaves were often referred to as living tools, empsycha or gana. Metics were dwellers together, but not sharers in the political life. Women were often confined to the gynaeconitis, the women's quarters, highlighting their separation from the male public sphere. This linguistic and architectural separation reinforced their lack of political voice and their peripheral role in the celebrated democracy. The psychological toll of living in a society that loudly proclaimed freedom and equality for its citizens, while systematically denying you any part in it, would be immense. You would constantly be reminded of your inferior status, your lack of agency, and your inability to shape your own political destiny. Your grievances, your opinions, your very voice were irrelevant in the eyes of the state. This silent, pervasive exclusion was a profound and constant source of misery, making the celebrated Athenian democracy a truly terrible system for the vast majority of people who lived within its walls. So, Your very existence in ancient Greek democracy was defined by the illusion of freedom, where your birth as a non-citizen immediately condemned you to a life without political voice. This pervasive exclusion, affecting women, slaves, and foreign residents alike, was the first and perhaps most foundational reason why Greek democracy was a terrible system for most people, ensuring that the grand experiment in self-governance was built on a vast foundation of disenfranchisement. Having been condemned to the illusion of freedom as a non-citizen, your existence within ancient Greek democracy, particularly in Athens, was built upon a chilling foundation: the brutal, dehumanizing labor of slavery. Forget the leisure of philosophical debate or civic participation. The very existence of Athenian democracy and its citizens' freedom was inextricably linked to the constant, unacknowledged toil of a vast enslaved population, making it a terrible system for most people. Imagine the sprawling, vibrant city of Athens. You see grand public buildings rising, busy workshops producing goods, and fertile fields outside the long walls. But who is building those temples? Who is working those silver mines at Laurion, which funded Athens' powerful navy? Who is tilling the fields and crafting the goods for the most part? It's not the citizens, it's the slaves. Your economic reality, if you were a male citizen, rested directly on the forced labor of countless individuals who had no rights, no freedom, and no voice in the very democracy they sustained. It truly sucked to be someone else's property. Slavery in ancient Athens was pervasive and fundamental to its economy and society. Estimates vary, but slaves likely constituted a significant portion of the Athenian population, often ranging from 25% to 40%, and sometimes even more. Particularly during the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, these slaves came from diverse origins: prisoners of war, individuals captured by pirates, or those born into servitude from enslaved parents. They were bought and sold in public markets, treated as property andropoda, and could be owned by private citizens or even by the state itself. For you, a slave, your life was one of relentless, uncompensated labor. Your duties would vary immensely depending on your owner and where you worked. Household slaves, you might serve in a private home, cooking, cleaning, fetching water, grinding grain, tending to children, or assisting your master or mistress, while some household slaves might develop a degree of trust or even affection with their owners. Their lives were still utterly controlled, their dignity constantly at risk. Agricultural slaves, you would toil in the fields outside the city, planting, cultivating, and harvesting crops like olives, grapes, and grains, enduring the harsh sun and arduous physical demands. Workshop slaves, you might work in small craft shops, producing pottery, textiles, or other goods, often alongside your owner, contributing directly to the city's booming economy. Mining slaves, this was perhaps the most brutal form of enslavement. Thousands of slaves worked in the Athenian silver mines at Laurion, south of Athens. Conditions in these mines were horrific: perpetual darkness, stifling heat, thin air, constant dust, and grueling. Backbreaking labors chipping away at rock. Life expectancy in the mines was notoriously short, often just a few years, due to accidents, disease, and sheer exhaustion. Imagine being chained underground, slowly wasting away, knowing your suffering funded the very democracy that kept you enslaved. It really sucked to mine silver for freedom you'd never know. Slaves in Athens had virtually no legal rights. They could not own property, though some might be allowed to accumulate a small peculium for their personal use. Ultimately belonging to the master, marry, legally though informal unions occurred, or bring lawsuits against their masters, though a master could be sued for excessive brutality towards his slave by someone else. Their testimony in court was often only accepted under torture, a horrifying indicator of their lack of legal standing and credibility. Their lives were utterly at the whim of their owners, who had the power to beat, sell, or even kill them, though intentional killing of a slave by a citizen could, in certain circumstances, be prosecuted by the state. It was still very rare. The economic structure of Athens, and indeed many other Greek city-states, was fundamentally reliant on this enslaved labor, the leisure time that allowed male citizens to participate in the assembly, to debate philosophy, to attend theater, and to train for military service, was directly provided by the unseen toil of the slave population. Their freedom was built on someone else's bondage. The democracy that celebrated citizen liberty simultaneously upheld a brutal system of human exploitation. One common misconception is that all ancient Greek slavery was benign or resembled indentured servitude in reality. While forms of debt slavery or less harsh servitude existed in some periods or city-states, Athenian chattel slavery, where individuals were bought, sold, and owned as property, was undeniably brutal. The scale of the mining operations, in particular, points to an extreme level of dehumanization and exploitation. Historians still meticulously study archaeological findings from slave quarters, mining sites, and detailed legal and economic texts to understand the precise nature, scale, and varying conditions of slavery across different sectors of the Athenian economy, confirming its brutal and pervasive reality. Furthermore, the very concept of citizenship was defined by its contrast with slavery. To be a citizen was to be free, to be autonomous, to have a political voice. This definition inherently required the existence of a class of unfree individuals. The more democratic Athens became for its citizens, the more stark the contrast with the utter lack of rights for its enslaved population. This created a profound moral paradox at the heart of Athenian democracy, a paradox that was largely unacknowledged by the citizens themselves, who viewed slavery as a natural and necessary part of the social order. The psychological toll on a slave would be immense. You would live with the constant threat of arbitrary violence, the complete absence of autonomy, and the crushing knowledge that your life was not your own. Your very body was a commodity, your labor perpetually uncompensated. This dehumanization, this constant awareness of your enslaved status in a society that celebrated freedom for others, would erode your spirit, leading to despair, apathy, or suppressed resentment. Your existence was a continuous struggle against physical exhaustion and spiritual degradation. The fact that slaves, despite their numbers, had no collective political voice or means to challenge their oppression, slave revolts were rare and swiftly crushed in Athens. Unlike in Rome, further underscores their helplessness within the democratic system. Their suffering was silently accepted, their existence taken for granted, as the wheels of Athenian democracy turned onward. Fueled by their silent labor, so your existence within ancient Greek democracy was built on the brutal, dehumanizing labor of slavery, this pervasive system, which denied vast numbers of people any rights or political voice, was the economic and social engine that powered Athenian citizens' freedom and leisure. This fundamental reliance on human exploitation was a defining, terrible aspect of Greek democracy, ensuring that the celebrated birthplace of self-governance was, for most people, a place of profound and unending misery, even as you witnessed the brutal reality of slavery underpinning Athenian democracy. Your own status as a woman, whether citizen-born or foreign, subjected you to a different yet equally pervasive form of exclusion. Forget public life, political participation, or even true intellectual freedom. Your world was largely confined by women's walls, dictating political silence and domestic confinement, making Greek democracy a terrible system for you. Imagine your daily life in Athens. Around the 5th century BCE, if you were a citizen woman, born into an Athenian family, your existence was governed by a strict set of social norms that placed you firmly outside the public sphere. Your primary domain was the oikos, the household. This wasn't just your home, it was your entire world, encompassing the physical dwelling, its inhabitants' family, slaves, and its management. Your days would be consumed by domestic duties overseeing the household slaves, managing food supplies, weaving and making clothes, and, most crucially, raising children. Your life was a ceaseless cycle of practical, essential, but largely unacknowledged labor within the confines of your home. It truly sucked to be a glorified housekeeper. You, as a citizen woman, had no political rights whatsoever. You could not vote, hold public office, attend the assembly ecclesia, serve on juries, or speak in public debates. These were privileges exclusively reserved for adult male citizens. Your voice was absent from the very democratic process that proudly proclaimed liberty. Your opinions, your intellect, your perspectives on state affairs were deemed irrelevant in the public sphere, confined to private conversations within the household, if at all. Imagine living in a city famed for its vibrant political discourse, yet being systematically silenced. Your intelligence and insight deemed unworthy of public expression. It really sucked to be mute in a democracy. Your legal standing was also severely limited. You were always considered a minor, perpetually under the legal guardianship of a male relative, your father, your husband, or if widowed, your adult son. You could not conduct legal transactions, own substantial property in your own name, though you might hold a dowry or inheritances in trust, or represent yourself in court without a male guardian acting on your behalf. Your legal identity was subsumed by that of your male protector, ensuring you remained dependent and without full autonomy. The physical boundaries of your life were often just as restrictive as the legal ones. Wealthy citizen women were largely confined to the gynaeconitis gyneconitis, the women's quarters of the house. This was typically located at the back of the house, on the upper floor, or in a secluded area, away from the male reception rooms andron where your husband entertained guests. While not a literal prison, venturing outside these quarters without a chaperone, or without a specific purpose, like attending a religious festival or a funeral, was often frowned upon and could damage your reputation. Your public appearances were limited to religious ceremonies or specific family events, always under strict supervision. It truly sucked to live in a gilded cage. Education for citizen women was also highly circumscribed, focused almost entirely on domestic skills, household management, and perhaps basic literacy to manage accounts or read religious texts. Unlike boys, you would not attend public schools or receive training in rhetoric, philosophy, or public speaking, as these skills were deemed unnecessary for your domestic role and potentially dangerous for your modesty. Your intellectual life, if any, was a private pursuit, rarely engaged in publicly or with male peers. For foreign women, medics, their situation was even more precarious. While some might engage in professions outside the home, like selling goods in the agora or working as wet nurses or courtesans, they too had no political rights, and their social status was even lower than citizen women. They were often vulnerable to exploitation and harassment. Without the protection of citizen male relatives, the prevailing philosophical and social attitudes reinforced this confinement. prominent male Athenians, even figures like Pericles, who praised Athenian women for being least spoken of among men, either for good or for evil, believed that a woman's virtue lay in her quiet domesticity and her unobtrusive nature. Her role was to produce legitimate heirs for the citizen body, to manage the household efficiently, and to maintain her family's honor through strict modesty. Any public visibility or independent action was viewed with suspicion and could lead to accusations of impropriety. One common misconception is that all ancient Greek women lived in extreme seclusion, while Athenian citizen women, particularly of the elite, did experience significant confinement. Women in other Greek city-states like Sparta, where women had more physical freedom and participated in public athletic training, or in lower social classes, might have had more direct engagement with public life due to economic necessity, i.e., working in markets. However, the fundamental exclusion from political power and official public discourse was a consistent feature across most Greek democracies. Historians still meticulously study Athenian legal texts concerning marriage and property. Archaeological findings of house layouts, especially the Gynaeconitis, and classical literary accounts to understand the precise daily lives and restrictions faced by Athenian women, confirming their profound domestic confinement. Furthermore, your personal desires, your intellectual aspirations, or any frustrations you might have felt about your limited role were systematically suppressed. The expectation was total conformity to the societal ideal. Any attempt to step outside these rigid boundaries would be met with social condemnation, damaging your reputation and bringing shame upon your family. This constant pressure to be virtuous in your silence and domesticity was a profound psychological burden, ensuring that your inner world, however rich, remained hidden and unheard. So, your existence within ancient Greek democracy as a woman was defined by women's walls, dictating political silence and domestic confinement. Your primary role was in the household, raising children and managing slaves, with no voice in the public sphere, no legal autonomy, and limited education beyond domestic skills. This pervasive exclusion and the systematic denial of your public identity made Greek democracy a terrible system for you, ensuring that your life was one of profound, unacknowledged domestic servitude in the very city that celebrated freedom, even as you, the Athenian woman, were confined by the walls of your oikos and silenced in the political sphere, and as slaves toiled beneath the democratic surface. There existed another group whose lives in Greek democracy were surprisingly difficult, the metics. Forget the promise of a vibrant, welcoming city as a foreign resident. You were a contributor without a voice, making your existence profoundly terrible. Imagine yourself in Athens. You are a free individual, perhaps a skilled craftsman, a wealthy merchant, or even a philosopher drawn by Athens' intellectual renown. You have chosen to live here, contributing your talents and your labor to the city's prosperity. Unlike slaves, you are free. You can own property, though usually not land, establish businesses, and move relatively freely. You pay taxes, serve in the military, particularly in the Athenian navy, filling its ranks as rowers or marines, and contribute significantly to Athens' economic and cultural life. But despite all your contributions, you are a perpetual outsider, a foreigner without a voice. It truly sucked to pay taxes to a government you couldn't vote for. The term metikos literally translates to one who dwells with. This meant you were a permanent resident, but not a citizen. This status carried significant limitations. The most fundamental was your complete exclusion from political life. You could not vote in the assembly ecclesia, hold public office, serve on juries, or participate in the legislative process. Your opinions on the laws that governed your life, on the wars that might take your livelihood or even your life, were utterly irrelevant in the eyes of the Athenian democracy. You lived under the laws but had no say in their making. Your legal status was also precarious. While free, you were not truly independent. You were required to have a citizen sponsor prostates, a male Athenian citizen who would represent your legal and civic interests. This sponsor would act as your advocate in legal matters and ensure your adherence to Athenian laws. Imagine your dependency on this one individual. Their goodwill was crucial for your legal standing. If your prostates died or became unreliable, you would have to find another. A constant source of potential vulnerability. It really sucked to have a human chaperone for your entire legal life. Owning land was generally forbidden to medics, while you could own houses, workshops, and other forms of movable property. The highly valued and foundational asset of land ownership was reserved exclusively for Athenian citizens. This limited your economic opportunities and prevented you from fully integrating into the agrarian backbone of Athenian society. It also meant your wealth, however great, was always viewed as less secure, less Athenian than that of a citizen landowner. Medics also faced specific taxes and duties that citizens did not. The most well-known was the medic tax mito ikion, a small annual head tax paid to the state. While not crippling, it was a symbolic reminder of your second-class status, a payment for the privilege of residing in Athens without enjoying full citizenship. You might also be required to perform specific public services liturgiae or contribute financially to state expenses, similar to citizens, but without receiving the corresponding political rights or social prestige. Imagine contributing your hard-earned money to public festivals or naval expenses, knowing you could never truly participate as an equal. The social stigma of being a medic, though often subtle, was pervasive. While some medics, particularly wealthy ones, might be respected for their contributions, you were always seen as an outsider. You could not fully participate in many religious festivals or civic rituals that were central to Athenian identity. Marriage between a metic and a citizen was generally prohibited, or their children would not gain citizenship, further limiting your social integration and ensuring that your status as a foreigner was passed down through generations. Your children would be medics too, trapped in the same limbo. It really sucked to be forever an outsider. One common misconception is that all medics were wealthy merchants who lived luxurious lives, while some undoubtedly were. The medic population was diverse, including skilled artisans, teachers, and even laborers. Many lived modest lives, contributing their skills to the Athenian economy, but without accumulating vast fortunes. Their economic contributions were vital, but their political and social standing remained precarious. Historians still meticulously study ancient Athenian legal texts, tax records, and census data to understand the precise economic roles and social conditions of the medic population, revealing a complex picture of their indispensable yet marginalized existence. Furthermore, the relationship between medics and citizens could be fraught with tension. While cooperation was common in daily life, citizens could sometimes exploit the medics' lack of rights, knowing they had less recourse for injustice. In times of war or political instability, medics could be vulnerable to arbitrary taxation, confiscation of property, or even expulsion from the city, highlighting the fragility of their unprotected status. Their contributions were valued, but their personal security was always at the whim of the citizen body. The psychological toll of living as a medic would be immense. You would contribute your labor, pay your taxes, and even fight in Athens' wars, yet constantly be reminded that you were not one of them. The proud declarations of Athenian democracy, celebrating the freedom and equality of its citizens, would serve as a constant, bitter reminder of your own disenfranchisement, this pervasive sense of exclusion, of being a permanent outsider in the very city you called home, would erode your spirit, leaving you with a profound sense of quiet resentment and unacknowledged contribution. So, your existence within ancient Greek democracy as a metic was defined by a precarious, second-class status, despite contributing greatly to Athens' economy and defense. You held no political power, faced legal vulnerabilities, and endured pervasive social stigma. This fundamental exclusion, this constant reality of being a foreigner without a voice, made Greek democracy a terrible system for you, ensuring that your life, for all its contributions, was one of profound marginalization and voicelessness, even as you, the metic, were denied a political voice, and as women were confined to their domestic spheres. The very foundation of Athenian democracy for its citizens was built upon a dangerous and often terrifying paradox: direct democracy itself, often devolving into mob rule and fickle whims. Forget reasoned debate and stable governance. You, as a citizen, would find your daily life dictated by the unpredictable passions of the assembly, making Greek democracy a terrible system for its supposedly privileged participants. Imagine yourself now, an adult male citizen of Athens, finally qualified to participate in the Ecclesia assembly. You ascend the Pnyx Hill, a vast open-air amphitheater where up to 6,000 citizens could gather. The air buzzes with energy, with passionate speeches and heated arguments. You feel a surge of pride. You are one of the demos, the ruling people. But this immense power of direct democracy, where every citizen had an equal vote, was a double-edged sword, constantly threatening to cut down even the most well-intentioned. It truly sucked to be ruled by a popularity contest. The assembly had absolute power. It voted on laws, decided in war and peace, elected or appointed by lot officials, and controlled state finances. There were no checks and balances in the modern sense, no powerful Senate to veto decisions, no independent judiciary to review legislation. The will of the majority on any given day was supreme and final. This meant that crucial decisions, impacting the lives of thousands, could be made based on passionate rhetoric, popular sentiment, or the emotional whims of the moment. Rather than careful deliberation or long-term strategy, think of the power of the demagogos. Demagogos. These were charismatic speakers who rose to prominence by appealing to the emotions and prejudices of the masses, rather than to their reason. A skilled orator could sway the assembly with powerful speeches, even if their proposals were reckless or ill-conceived. You, the citizen, would be bombarded by eloquent arguments, perhaps lacking the education or the time to critically evaluate complex policy issues. You were expected to vote on critical matters with little prior knowledge or opportunity for deep analysis, often swept up in the emotion of the moment. Imagine casting your vote for war because a charismatic speaker made a great speech, only for it to lead to disaster. It really sucked to vote on gut feelings, not facts. The sheer size of the assembly also contributed to its volatile nature. 6,000 men, all with a direct vote, could be easily swayed by collective emotion, panic, or a particularly compelling speaker, rational. Nuanced debate was often difficult to maintain. Decisions could be reversed swiftly, alliances could shift dramatically, and a policy supported one day could be condemned the next, leading to political instability and a lack of consistent governance. This unpredictability made long-term planning difficult and could lead to disastrous miscalculations. The infamous Mytilenean debate during the Peloponnesian War is a chilling example. Athens initially voted to execute all adult male citizens of Mytilene and enslave its women and children after a revolt. The next day, swayed by a more reasoned argument from Diodotus, the assembly narrowly reversed its decision, sending a second ship which arrived just in time to countermand the first. This dramatic reversal highlights the volatile nature of direct democracy, where the fate of an entire city could literally hinge on a single. Emotional debate. Imagine being part of such a decision, knowing your vote could condemn thousands, and then watching it almost immediately be reversed. It was a terrifying pendulum of justice and cruelty. It really sucked to be part of a mob that changed its mind after the fact. Furthermore, the system was susceptible to factionalism and personal rivalries. Political leaders would often use the assembly as an arena to attack their opponents, seeking to discredit them or even have them exiled through ostracism, which we'll discuss later. This meant that debates were often less about the common good and more about personal vendettas, reducing critical policy decisions to popularity contests or power struggles between influential individuals. You, the citizen, were a pawn in these rivalries, your vote a tool in someone else's political game. One common misconception is that Athenian democracy was always effective and just simply because it was democratic, while revolutionary for its time. Its direct nature also meant it lacked the institutional safeguards against irrational decision-making, mob mentality, and the tyranny of the majority that later, more representative democracies would develop. The fate of Socrates, condemned to death by a jury of his peers for impiety and corrupting the youth, serves as a stark reminder of how even a democratic system could suppress dissenting voices and make politically unpopular decisions that, in hindsight, seem profoundly unjust. Historians still meticulously study the mechanisms of Athenian direct democracy, analyzing its strengths, citizen participation, and its significant weaknesses, vulnerability to demagoguery, lack of expert input, protection of individual rights to understand its complex legacy, the constant need to attend assembly meetings, which could be frequent, especially during wartime, and to participate actively, was also a time commitment that was not always feasible for every citizen. While poorer citizens might be paid a small sum for attendance to encourage participation, wealthier citizens often had their own businesses or estates to manage. This constant demand on your time to participate in the often chaotic and unpredictable political process could become a burden, especially if the decisions made were later reversed or led to disaster. The psychological toll of this system was immense. You were constantly immersed in political debates, forced to make critical decisions, and aware that your vote could have profound consequences. This pervasive political pressure, coupled with the volatility of the assembly, could lead to anxiety, frustration, and a profound sense of helplessness when caught in the sway of powerful demagogues or shifting public opinion. Your freedom came with a heavy psychological price tag. So your experience as an Athenian citizen in Greek democracy, while offering unparalleled political participation, was profoundly terrible due to direct democracy's inherent flaws, often devolving into mob rule and fickle whims. Crucial decisions were made by passionate rhetoric and popular sentiment, leading to unpredictable policy shifts, constant factionalism, and a terrifying susceptibility to demagoguery. This chaotic, unstable political environment ensured that even the most privileged participants found their lives dictated by the arbitrary and often disastrous decisions of the collective. Even as you, the citizen, grappled with the chaotic unpredictability of direct democracy and the power of fickle demagogues, your very city, Athens, was built upon another brutal reality that directly impacted its poorest citizens, the naval lifeline. Forget glorious sea battles. The maintenance of Athens' powerful navy, powered by its most vulnerable citizens, came at a horrifying cost of forced service, extreme hardship, and profound exploitation, making this aspect of Greek democracy profoundly terrible. Imagine Athens at its peak. Its power was not just on land, but at sea. The Athenian navy, with its hundreds of nimble triremes, three-banked oared warships, was the undisputed master of the Aegean, protecting trade routes, projecting power, and ensuring the city's economic survival. This massive fleet required immense manpower, particularly skilled rowers. And who filled these ranks? Not primarily the wealthy citizens, who served as hoplites in the infantry, but the poorest Athenian citizens, the thetes, along with medics and slaves. It truly sucked to be an economic essential, but a social disposable. As a thete, you were at the very bottom of the Athenian citizen class, lacking the property qualifications to serve as a hoplite, but your role as a rower in the navy was indispensable. While it offered a path to civic participation, your service made you a vital part of Athenian power and a daily wage, however meager. The conditions of that service were utterly brutal. You would spend weeks, months, sometimes years away from home, packed into the cramped, unsanitary confines of a trireme. A trireme was a marvel of ancient engineering, designed for speed and maneuverability, but it was a hellish environment for its crew. Imagine being one of the 170 rowers, packed tightly together on 3 different levels, your body sweating profusely, muscles aching from the rhythmic, ceaseless effort of rowing. You would sit for hours, your legs braced, your arms pulling at the heavy oar, your body subjected to constant friction from the oar bench, leading to painful sores and calluses. The air below deck would be stifling, thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale sweat, and human waste. As proper sanitation was almost non-existent, it truly sucked to row for freedom. The food and water provided were meager and monotonous. Your diet would consist of hardtack dry biscuits, salted fish, onions, and stale water stored in wooden casks. Fresh fruits and vegetables were rare, leading to rampant scurvy and other nutritional deficiencies. Water would quickly become putrid, fostering waterborne diseases like dysentery that would sweep through the cramped crew, rapidly incapacitating and killing dozens. Imagine suffering from agonizing stomach cramps and relentless diarrhea, your body rapidly dehydrating while still being expected to row. It really sucked to be constantly sick and stuck on a boat. Discipline was harsh. While theoretically free citizens, naval commanders wielded immense power. Floggings, severe verbal reprimands, and brutal punishments were common for any perceived slackness, disobedience, or incompetence. Your life, your health, and your very endurance were sacrificed to the relentless demands of maintaining a powerful, efficient fighting machine. Disease was a constant, terrifying companion. Beyond scurvy and dysentery, typhoid fever, malaria, and various other fevers would sweep through naval crews, especially during campaigns in hot, humid climates. The crowded, unsanitary conditions of the ship were ideal breeding grounds for pathogens, leading to massive casualties that often dwarfed losses from actual combat. The plague of Athens itself, as we discussed in a previous episode, devastated Athens' naval power by killing many of its rowers and citizens confined within the city walls. The physical toll of this life was immense. Your body would be constantly aching, your hands blistered and raw from rowing, your muscles perpetually strained. Hearing loss from the constant noise of the oars in the sea, And vision problems from constant exposure to sun and salt spray would be common. Your short life expectancy, already low in ancient times, would be further shortened by disease, hardship, and the very real possibility of dying in battle. It truly sucked to literally row yourself to death. One common misconception is that Athenian rowers were always slaves, while slaves certainly supplemented the naval workforce, particularly in non-combat roles or as auxiliary crew. The backbone of the Athenian trireme crews, the primary rowers, were often poor Athenian citizens, thetes. Their service in the navy was a source of pride and, crucially, a means of contributing to the democracy, as their indispensable role in maintaining Athens' power gave them significant political leverage, leading to reforms that further empowered the assembly. This unique blend of civic pride and brutal exploitation highlights the complex social contract of Athenian democracy. Historians still meticulously study naval pay records, ship manifests, and classical texts to understand the precise social composition and living conditions of Athenian trireme crews, often finding a surprising mix of citizens, medics, and slaves, all enduring similar brutal realities. Furthermore, the very nature of naval warfare meant constant danger. You were not just fighting other ships, you were battling the sea itself. Storms could sink your trireme in an instant, drowning hundreds of men, collisions during maneuvers, or the sheer chaos of a naval battle could trap you below deck, leading to death by drowning, fire, or enemy action. Your survival was a constant gamble against the elements and the enemy. The psychological toll of long voyages, constant danger, and the monotonous, brutal labor of rowing would be immense. You would live with a perpetual sense of anxiety, homesickness, and the gnawing fear of disease or death. The freedom you supposedly gained as a citizen rower came at an incredibly high personal cost, transforming you into a hardened, yet deeply suffering instrument of Athenian imperial power. So, your life as a Thete serving in the Athenian navy was a defining example of how Greek democracy was a terrible system for most people. The maintenance of Athens' powerful fleet relied on the brutal, exploitative labor of its poorest citizens, enduring cramped, unsanitary conditions, chronic disease, and constant physical punishment. This horrifying reality of naval service was a profound paradox, ensuring that the very lifeline of Athenian freedom was powered by the misery and sacrifice of its most vulnerable citizens. Even as you, the Thete, strained your body at the oar, or as the medic sought a precarious livelihood, your life as a male Athenian citizen, however privileged in theory, came with a brutal, unavoidable, mandatory military service. Forget armchair philosophizing. You were a citizen soldier, a disposable pawn on the battlefield, making the constant threat of war a profoundly terrible aspect of Greek democracy. Imagine Athens, a city that prided itself on its democracy and intellectual pursuits, yet its very existence. And your rights as a citizen were inextricably linked to its military might. As a male citizen, you were expected to serve in the Athenian military from the age of 18 after your ephibeia, or military training until the age of 60. This wasn't a volunteer force, it was a universal obligation, a duty you could not refuse without severe penalties, including loss of citizenship. Your life was literally owned by the state for military service. It truly sucked to be born a soldier. Your specific role in the military would depend on your wealth. If you were a wealthy citizen, you would serve as a hoplite oplitus, a heavily armed infantryman. This meant providing your own expensive armor and weaponry, a bronze helmet, a large round shield, hoplon, greaves for your legs, and a long spear dory and a short sword, xiphos. You would fight in a disciplined phalanx formation, a terrifying wall of shields and spears where every man's shield protected his neighbor, and your survival depended on the cohesion of the line. Training was rigorous, often involving physical exercises in the gymnasium and drills with your peers, but the reality of battle was far different from practice. If you were a Thete, a poorer citizen, your primary military role would be as a rower in the Athenian navy. As we discussed in Chapter 6, this was equally brutal, involving immense physical exertion, cramped living conditions, disease, and the constant threat of naval combat or drowning. So, regardless of your wealth, military service was a harsh, physically demanding, and often deadly reality. The reality of ancient warfare was profoundly brutal. Forget clean, decisive battles. You would face chaotic, bloody melees where hand-to-hand combat was visceral and terrifying. Swords would hack, spears would thrust, and the ground would quickly become slick with blood and gore. There were no Geneva Conventions, no prisoners' rights. If defeated, you faced enslavement, torture, or a swift, merciless death. The psychological toll of witnessing such brutality, of having to kill or be killed, was immense, leaving deep, indelible scars on your psyche. It really sucked to literally fight for your life in a mob. Your life, as a citizen soldier, was constantly on the line due to the political decisions of the assembly. When the ecclesia voted for war, you, the citizen, were the one who had to march to battle, a reckless decision by a demagogue. A miscalculation in strategy or a sudden reversal of policy could lead directly to your death or the death of your comrades. You bore the ultimate consequence of democratic decision-making, a direct and horrifying link between politics and personal sacrifice. The risk of death was incredibly high. Battlefields were slaughterhouses, and even if you survived a specific engagement, you faced the omnipresent threats of disease, starvation, and exposure during long campaigns. More soldiers died from illness than from combat wounds in ancient warfare. If you were severely wounded, ancient medicine offered little effective treatment, and you might face a slow, agonizing death from infection or gangrene, far from the comforts of home. It truly sucked to survive a battle only to die of a fever. One common misconception is that Athenian citizens were always eager to go to war, embodying a fierce martial spirit. While Athenian citizens certainly valued military prowess and civic duty, the realities of protracted warfare like the Peloponnesian War often led to war weariness, dissent, and a reluctance to serve, particularly among those who had suffered immense personal losses. Debates in the assembly over military strategy often reflected deep divisions and anxieties about the cost of war. Historians still meticulously study casualty lists, military pay records, and the rhetoric of Athenian plays and speeches to understand the precise motivations and psychological impact of warfare on the citizen body, finding a complex mix of patriotism, self-interest, and profound apprehension. Furthermore, the very concept of dying for the polis was central to Athenian civic virtue. To fall in battle, defending your city, was considered the ultimate act of heroism and honor, guaranteeing your place in civic memory. Your name would be inscribed on public monuments, and your family would be honored. This powerful ideal served as a profound motivator, pushing citizens to endure unimaginable hardships and face certain death. However, it also put immense pressure on you to sacrifice your life for an abstract ideal, even when the political reasons for war might be questionable. The psychological toll of constant military readiness and the frequent reality of combat would be immense. You lived under the shadow of war, knowing that at any moment you could be called away from your family, your farm, or your craft to face death on a distant battlefield. This pervasive anxiety, coupled with the trauma of witnessing violence and loss, would leave indelible scars on your psyche, shaping your worldview and your understanding of life itself. So, your life as a male Athenian citizen, despite its supposed privileges, was profoundly terrible due to mandatory military service and the constant threat of war. You were a citizen soldier, compelled to fight and potentially die for political decisions you might not agree with, enduring brutal combat, rampant disease, and a high risk of an agonizing end. This pervasive threat of warfare, a direct consequence of Greek democracy's external policies, ensured that your freedom came at the ultimate cost of your body and your very life, making it a profoundly terrifying system for most of its participants, even as you, the Athenian citizen, grappled with the brutal realities of mandatory military service and the terrifying proximity of war. Your participation in Greek democracy presented a unique and profoundly chilling form of punishment, ostracism, forget legal trials or physical pain. This was a democratic tool used to exile citizens, often without a specific crime, based purely on popular vote, making its threat a profoundly terrible aspect of Athenian civic life. Imagine the atmosphere in the assembly when the decision to hold an ostracism was made. This wasn't for specific crimes like theft or murder. Instead, ostracism was a procedure designed to remove a citizen who was deemed too powerful, too popular, too ambitious, or simply too politically inconvenient. Even if they had committed no legal offense, the process was meant to prevent tyranny and maintain the stability of the democracy by exiling individuals who might threaten it. But for you, the individual, it was a terrifying sword of Damocles hanging over your head. It truly sucked to be too good at your job. The procedure itself was chillingly simple and public. Once a year, the assembly would vote on whether to hold an ostracism. If the vote passed, citizens would gather in the agora on a designated day. Each citizen would then scratch the name of the person they wished to ostracize onto a potsherd ostracon. These ostraca would then be collected and counted. If a man received at least 6,000 votes, he would be ostracized. He would then be forced to leave Athens for 10 years, without losing his property or his citizenship rights, but unable to participate in Athenian political or social life. Imagine the crushing realization that your fellow citizens, perhaps even your friends or former allies, had voted to banish you. It truly sucked to be canceled by a pottery shard. The reasons for ostracism were often vague and politically motivated. You might be ostracized simply because your family was too influential, or because you were a prominent leader whose policies clashed with the prevailing sentiment, or even because a demagogue successfully stirred up popular resentment against you. There was no formal charge, no specific accusation of wrongdoing that you could defend against in a court of law. Your banishment was based on the collective judgment of the assembly, a popular vote that determined your political and social annihilation. For you, the ostracized citizen, the immediate consequence was profound social and political isolation. You were forced to leave your home. Your family, though your family, could remain in Athens, your friends, and your entire social network. You could not participate in the vibrant civic life that defined Athenian citizenship. Your public role, your identity as an active participant in the democracy, was abruptly severed. You would live for a decade as an exile, a stateless person in the wider Greek world, relying on the hospitality of others or your own ingenuity to survive. Imagine the psychological toll of being banished from the only life you've ever known, simply because you were too successful or too visible. It really sucked to be exiled for being popular. The financial implications could also be significant. While you retained your property in Athens, managing it from afar could be difficult, and your income might be severely curtailed. You would incur expenses for your forced relocation and for living abroad. Your family, left behind in Athens, would also face financial and social burdens due to your absence and the public stigma of your ostracism. This was a form of slow, dignified punishment, designed to break your spirit without directly harming your body. The psychological toll of ostracism was immense. You would grapple with profound feelings of injustice, betrayal, and loneliness. The knowledge that thousands of your fellow citizens had explicitly voted for your banishment, even without a crime, would be a deeply scarring experience. You would live with the constant uncertainty of whether you would truly be able to return after 10 years, or if your name would be tainted forever. This permanent mark of public disapproval, this democratic branding, would haunt your thoughts for a decade. One common misconception is that ostracism was frequently used to punish powerful citizens. In reality, while it was a known procedure and used against some very prominent figures like Themistocles, Aristides, and Cimon, it was actually employed relatively infrequently throughout Athenian history. Its very existence and the public fear it instilled might have been enough to encourage moderation among ambitious politicians, making it a powerful deterrent even when not actively invoked. The procedure was eventually discontinued in the late 5th century BCE, possibly because it was increasingly misused for factional infighting, losing its original purpose of preventing tyranny. Historians still meticulously study the surviving ostraca. Tens of thousands have been found in archaeological excavations and classical texts to understand the precise political motivations and impact of each recorded ostracism. Furthermore, the threat of ostracism could lead to self-censorship among ambitious citizens, knowing that expressing too strong an opinion or becoming too popular could lead to banishment, might encourage individuals to moderate their views or avoid challenging the prevailing public sentiment. This, paradoxically, could limit the true democratic debate and encourage conformity, making the system less robust than it appeared on the surface. Your freedom of speech came with an implicit warning. Don't be too influential. The very public nature of the vote, with names scratched on potsherds, created a unique form of social pressure. While the vote was secret, the act of preparing your ostracon would be visible, and the overall outcome a public event. This collective judgment, delivered by the masses, was a terrifying display of democratic power, wielding banishment as a weapon against individual influence. So, your experience as an Athenian citizen, while offering the privilege of political participation, was profoundly terrible due to the chilling power of ostracism. This democratic tool, used to exile individuals for political expediency rather than specific crime, meant that even at the height of your influence, your fate could be decided by popular vote, leading to a decade of profound social and political isolation. This pervasive threat of banishment, wielded by your fellow citizens, ensured that even the most powerful found their lives ultimately precarious within the Athenian democratic system, even as you, the ostracized citizen, endured the silent judgment of your peers. And as other non-citizens lived under systematic exclusion, your participation in Greek democracy, however privileged it seemed, came with a chilling, inherent flaw: the tyranny of the majority. Forget protections for individual rights or the sanctity of dissenting opinions. In Athens, the will of the assembly could crush any minority voice, even leading to death, making this aspect of Greek democracy profoundly terrible. Imagine standing in the assembly, a full male citizen, but you hold a dissenting opinion on a crucial policy. Perhaps you believe a proposed war is reckless, or an alliance detrimental, or a punishment disproportionate. You, technically, have the right to speak, to debate, to argue your point. But the very structure of direct democracy, devoid of modern checks and balances, could turn the collective into a terrifying, unforgiving mob, ready to silence or condemn anyone who dared to challenge the prevailing sentiment. It truly sucked to have your freedom of speech be conditional. The assembly's power was absolute. There was no Supreme Court to strike down an unjust law, no Bill of Rights to protect individual liberties, no strong independent executive to veto a popular but tyrannical decision. If the majority of citizens, swayed by a charismatic demagogue or inflamed by emotion, voted for a particular course of action, that decision was final and binding. This meant that the rights of the individual were ultimately subservient to the will of the collective, however rash or unjust that collective will might be. The infamous trial and execution of Socrates serves as the most stark and chilling example of this tyranny. Socrates, a beloved philosopher who challenged conventional wisdom and encouraged critical thinking, was accused by citizens of impiety and corrupting the youth. He faced a jury of 501 Athenian citizens, an embodiment of the democratic ideal. Despite his eloquent defense, the jury, swayed by popular sentiment and perhaps discomfort with his radical ideas, voted to condemn him to death. He was then forced to drink hemlock, dying for his philosophical beliefs, not for a violent crime. Imagine witnessing this, a democracy voting to execute one of its wisest citizens for his idea. It really sucked when democracy killed philosophers. This incident profoundly shook later Greek thinkers like Plato, Socrates' student, who became deeply skeptical of direct democracy, arguing that it could easily devolve into mob rule, prioritizing popular opinion over truth and justice. Plato's critique, influenced by his mentor's fate, highlighted the inherent danger of a system where every citizen's vote held equal weight, regardless of their wisdom or knowledge, making it susceptible to demagoguery and irrationality. Beyond individual executions, the tyranny of the majority could manifest in other brutal ways. Arbitrary laws. The assembly could pass laws that were punitive toward specific groups or individuals, or that reversed previous decisions with little stability. Confiscation of property. If a citizen fell out of favor, or was deemed an enemy of the state even without a specific crime, their property could be seized by a vote of the assembly. Political purges. The atmosphere could become so charged that powerful figures might find themselves accused and condemned simply for being too prominent or for holding unpopular views, leading to their ostracism or worse. The lack of a concept of minority rights or individual constitutional protections like a Bill of Rights made this system terrifying for anyone who dared to dissent. Your freedom of speech existed only so long as it did not offend the majority. Your property was secure only so long as you remained in favor. Your very life could be forfeit if the collective decided it was a threat, or simply inconvenient. One common misconception is that Athenian democracy, because of its emphasis on citizen participation, inherently protected individual liberties. While Athenians certainly valued citizen liberties, these were primarily understood as collective rights within the polis, not as inherent, inalienable individual rights protected from the will of the majority. The concept of individual rights against the state is largely a modern development. Historians still meticulously study Athenian legal processes, like graphe paranomon lawsuits against illegal proposals and philosophical critiques. Plato, Aristotle. Thucydides, to understand the practical limits on individual freedom and the mechanisms by which the majority could enforce its will in Athenian democracy. Furthermore, the pressure to conform, to not stand out, would be immense, knowing that a vocal dissenting opinion could turn the assembly against you, could lead to public condemnation or even ostracism, would encourage self-censorship. You might bite your tongue, hide your true beliefs, or vote against your conscience, simply to survive and maintain your position within the citizen body. This subtle erosion of intellectual honesty, born of fear, was a profound psychological cost of living in such a direct democracy. The very strength of Athenian democracy, its direct citizen participation, paradoxically became its greatest weakness when that participation was swayed by emotion rather than reason. The collective will, however noble in theory, could become a ruthless, unpredictable force, crushing individual dissent and making arbitrary decisions that, in hindsight, seem profoundly unjust. So, your life as a male Athenian citizen, despite its outward political privilege, was profoundly terrible due to the tyranny of the majority, the absolute power of the assembly. Susceptible to demagoguery and popular whims, meant that individual rights were precarious, dissenting voices could be crushed, and even the greatest minds could be condemned to death for their ideas. This chilling lack of protection for the individual ensured that Greek democracy, for many, was a system that valued the collective will above all else, even human life and fundamental justice. You've endured the crushing reality of being born a non-citizen, witnessing the brutal foundation of slavery, experienced the confinement of women's roles, lived as a voiceless medic, suffered under the chaotic unpredictability of direct democracy, toiled as a naval rower, faced the terrifying call to mandatory military service, and grappled with the chilling threat of ostracism and the ultimate tyranny of the majority. As the echoes of ancient debates fade and the phantom taste of olives dissipates, a final, chilling truth settles upon you. Ancient Greek democracy, for all its revolutionary ideals, was a deeply flawed system for most people, a fragile utopia built on pervasive exclusion and the constant threat of arbitrary power. Consider the illusion of universal freedom. While Athens proudly championed its democratic ideals, its very definition of the people, demos, was incredibly narrow, only a small fraction of the population free. Adult. Athenian-born males could participate. This meant the vast majority of residents, including women, slaves, and medics, were systematically excluded from political life, stripped of fundamental rights, and relegated to a voiceless existence. Your exclusion was not an oversight. It was a deliberate, foundational principle, ensuring that the celebrated freedom of some was directly dependent on the subjugation of many. It truly sucked to be an outsider in a land of freedom. Then there's the brutal economic and social stratification. The leisure time and civic participation enjoyed by male citizens were directly supported by the relentless, dehumanizing labor of a vast enslaved population. Women, whether citizen wives or foreign residents, were confined to domestic roles, their intellectual and public contributions systematically suppressed. Medics, though free and economically vital, remained perpetual outsiders, paying taxes and serving in the military without any corresponding political voice or legal security. This pervasive social hierarchy ensured that the benefits of democracy were concentrated in the hands of a privileged few, while the vast majority endured lives of unacknowledged toil and fundamental disenfranchisement. And what about the inherent instability and potential for arbitrary power, even for citizens' direct democracy, while innovative, lacked crucial checks and balances? Decisions could be swayed by passionate rhetorics, mob rule, and fickle popular whims, leading to erratic policy shifts and disastrous consequences like the Mytilenean debate. The power of ostracism, a chilling tool of democratic banishment, hung over even the most prominent citizens, capable of exiling them without a crime. The ultimate tyranny of the majority, as exemplified by the tragic fate of Socrates, meant that individual rights and dissenting voices could be utterly crushed, transforming the pursuit of justice into a perilous gamble for anyone who challenged the prevailing sentiment. It really sucked when your fellow citizens could literally vote you to death. Finally, the constant burden of military service for male citizens. Their democratic rights came with the non-negotiable obligation to serve in the military. Enduring brutal conditions as hoplites or naval rowers, they faced constant threats of war, disease, and death on the battlefield, paying the ultimate price for political decisions made in the assembly. This pervasive threat of warfare, intrinsic to the defense and expansion of the polis, ensured that even a citizen's life was lived under the heavy shadow of potential sacrifice, making their freedom a profound and costly one. The very concept of Greek democracy, while pioneering, was a fragile utopia. It was revolutionary for its time, laying some groundwork for future political thought, but it was far from the inclusive ideal we strive for today. Its internal contradictions, its reliance on a vast underclass, and its susceptibility to the unpredictable will of the majority meant that its celebrated freedom was a selective privilege, not a universal right. The prosperity and glory of Athens were built on a foundation of pervasive exclusion, leaving a complex and often terrible legacy. One particularly poignant and often overlooked detail is the rhetorical mastery demanded of Athenian citizens. In a direct democracy where every vote counted and debates were central, the ability to speak persuasively, to construct a logical argument, and to captivate an audience was paramount. This meant that even ordinary citizens were expected to cultivate rhetorical skills to participate effectively in the assembly or the courts. However, this emphasis also opened the door for demagogues to exploit emotions rather than reason, highlighting the inherent vulnerability of a system that relied so heavily on verbal persuasion. Historians still meticulously study ancient Greek rhetorical treatises and philosophical critiques like those of Plato and Aristotle to understand the precise role of rhetoric in shaping political decisions and the ethical dilemmas it posed for citizens in a direct democracy. Ultimately, your experience in ancient Greek democracy would be one of profound complexity and often immense suffering. The ideal of self-governance, however brilliant in theory, was implemented in a way that excluded the vast majority, exploited the unfree, constrained women, and often proved terrifyingly arbitrary even for its privileged citizens. The legacy of Greek democracy, for all its glory, remains a powerful and terrible reminder that true freedom is far broader and more inclusive than even its earliest proponents could envision. As you now drift into a deep, comforting sleep, let the distant sounds of ancient debates and the imagined clamor of the agora finally subside. You're safe, in your own time, far removed from the brutal realities of ancient Greek political life. May your dreams be peaceful, filled with the quiet certainty of universal rights, equal representation, and the profound comfort of a democracy that strives to include all. A stark contrast to the terrible truth we've explored tonight. And now, good night, and have sweet dreams.